It's said, the desert keeps secrets. Maybe it's the heat. Maybe it's the silence. Or maybe it's something else entirely. You know how some stories just stick with you? The kind that burrow into your memory and resurface years later when you're driving through empty desert highways or flipping through old newspaper clippings. This is one of those stories. And like most, it begins in a place where secrets go to hide. We're talking about the Nevada desert. That vast, sun-bleached expanse where the government has always done its most interesting work. Out there, past the rusted gates and faded road signs, beyond where our maps start to get vague and our certainties begin to waver, there's a name that still gets whispered in certain circles. Bob Lazar. Now, if you were around in the late 80s and early 90s, you might remember how this all unfolded. But for those who weren't there, picture this. It was a time when we still got our news from 3 television networks, when extraordinary claims came through grainy VHS tapes, passed hand to hand, and when the internet was just a glimmer in some computer scientist's eye. It was easier then to keep secrets, and harder to verify them. Bob wasn't always a guy talking about flying spaceships on late-night television. He started out like the rest of us, a kid with too much curiosity for his own good. Born in Coral Gables, Florida, in January of '59, he was the type who'd wire things together just to see what would happen. The kind always taking apart radios, building rockets in the backyard. The sort of restless intelligence that either becomes a physicist or accidentally burns down the garage. By 1980, Bob had drifted west to Las Vegas. And really, where would a guy like that end up? Vegas in those days was still more rat-packed than corporate resort. A town built on the fundamental human desire to believe in impossible odds, where the line between reality and performance was always a little blurry. Behind all that neon and noise, Bob claimed he found work at Los Alamos, where we split the atom and changed the world forever, whether we meant to or not. But here's where our story takes a turn that still gives people pause, all these decades later. Someone, and we've never learned who, apparently noticed young Bob, because not long after his time in New Mexico, he was invited into what he described as a different kind of world entirely, a world where the rules we grew up with didn't seem to apply. The moment he stepped through that doorway, and Bob always spoke about it like there was a specific moment, a threshold cross, everything changed. He described entering a reality where time moved differently, where the impossible became routine, where mountains held secrets in their concrete and steel bellies. Whether you believe what happened next or not, and we'll get to that, everyone agrees on one thing. The man who emerged from that experience was never quite the same. The weight of whatever he'd seen began pressing down on him like desert heat, inescapable, suffocating. He started noticing things, the way conversations stopped when he walked into rooms, helicopters that seemed to patrol his neighborhood with unusual frequency, cars with tinted windows that lingered just a little too long on his street. And before you think paranoia, remember, this was the same government that had spent decades doing MKUltra. Sometimes paranoia is just pattern recognition. So he made a decision that was either brilliantly brave or completely reckless, depending on how you look at it. If they were going to make his life a prison of suspicion and surveillance, then maybe it was time to give them something real to worry about. He decided to bring witnesses into the desert. Now, Bob knew this was against every rule in whatever book they'd shown him. The consequences could be severe. And in government work of this nature, severe often means more than just losing your security clearance. But sometimes when you're drowning in secrets, the only way to breathe is to share them with someone else, even if they might drown too. He knew the schedule. Wednesday evenings, under cover of night. Fewer eyes, fewer questions. Bob gathered a small group, including a fellow physicist named Gene Hoff, armed with camcorder, field glasses, and a little fear. He led them out into the Nevada wilderness, far from pavement, far from civilization, up on a ridge with a clear view toward a lake bed, where impossible things supposedly happened on government time. No talk, only breath and hope. They waited in that particular desert silence, where the only sound is wind moving through sagebrush and your own heartbeat. Then they saw it, a quiet orb of light, emerging above the black ridgeline, not blinking like an aircraft, not flickering like a star. Just there, steady and patient and completely unexplained. And then, as if someone had flipped a switch in the laws of physics, it moved, not like anything we'd ever seen fly. No gradual acceleration, no respect for momentum or gravity. It darted upward, pivoted left, dropped down again, as fluid as thought itself. In that moment, watching something that made no sense according to everything we thought we knew about flight, every wild claim Bob had made suddenly felt a little more possible. The group could barely breathe. Their hands shook as they tried to capture what they were seeing, though the grainy film barely held more than a few glowing dots against the night sky. But in their minds, they'd witnessed something that confirmed everything Bob had been trying to tell them. He hadn't imagined it. They were looking at a truth that had been hidden from the rest of the world. Of course, quiet eyes had been watching them too. On a later expedition, men in black gear emerged from the shadows like something out of a thriller novel. No warnings, no shouting, just firm orders and weapons ready. Names were taken, film confiscated. Bob was detained, not gently, not politely. He had crossed a line, and now they wanted a detailed explanation. They showed him transcripts of his phone conversations. Clear proof that his every word had been monitored. The message was direct. Never come back. His involvement with whatever was happening at S4 was finished. But the surveillance didn't end. If anything, it intensified. He was followed, harassed, threatened in ways that made it clear this wasn't going away quietly. So Bob made what might have been the most important decision of his life. If the government wanted to silence him, he would speak first. Loudly, publicly, and without apology. That's when he reached out to George Knapp at KLAS-TV in Las Vegas. Now, Knapp wasn't some tabloid sensationalist chasing UFO stories for ratings. He was the kind of journalist who spent months verifying tips, who understood that credibility takes years to build and seconds to destroy. The decision to go with Knapp was strategic and deliberate. When you're about to tell the world you've been reverse engineering alien technology, you don't start with the conspiracy theorists. You begin with the people who expect their evening news to be credible. In 1989, Bob stepped into the light. Well, sort of. He appeared on camera using the pseudonym Dennis, his face obscured by shadows, making claims that stunned everyone who heard them. Steady eyes, measured speech, the kind of composure that made you lean forward rather than roll your eyes. This wasn't some guy ranting about alien abductions outside a 7-Eleven. He spoke like an engineer explaining a blueprint. Methodical, exact, almost uncomfortable with the attention he was getting. The story he told was extraordinary. He claimed that since the late 1940s, the US government had been in possession of alien technology. And while we were celebrating the end of World War II and planning our suburban futures, apparently proof of extraterrestrial life was sitting in a desert hangar. 9 craft housed at a facility called S4, carved right into the mountain south of Groom Lake, near Papoose Lake. Not some Hollywood soundstage. This place supposedly sat tunneled into living rock, each hangar housing a single alien craft behind bay doors, camouflaged to make you drive right past without a second thought. His job, according to Bob, was to reverse engineer the thrust mechanism of one of these craft. He described clocking in each morning to unravel technology that defied reality itself. These words hung in the air with a weight that seemed almost tangible. Here was a man describing his assignment, not as theory or speculation, but just a day's work, unraveling technology that defied everything we thought we knew about physics. The craft was powered by an element called 115, an isotope not found naturally on Earth. The details he offered weren't your typical UFO folklore either. He described the weight distribution of the hull, the peculiar properties of element 115, the barren corridors of S4, and a hand scanner to measure bone in one's hand. At the time, many found it odd, even made up, but later, photographic proof turned up of nearly identical devices in military installations. A minor detail, yet a telling one. But here's where things get interesting, in that uniquely frustrating way that defines the best mysteries. When skeptics went looking for Bob's academic credentials, his claimed degrees from Caltech and MIT, they found nothing. No graduation photos, no thesis papers, no drinking buddies who remembered late nights in the physics lab. It was as if that entire period of his life had been carefully erased from the record. Some insisted he had never been there. Others insisted he had, but had been cloaked in maximum security. He lingered like a ghost in the machine, just a name quietly listed in a dusty phone book or in a grainy newspaper clipping with a jet car. It was as if that period of his life had been carefully erased, hidden in plain view, or exactly where someone wanted him to be, like a flicker in a reel of lost film. There, then gone. Bob's explanation? Of course they erased it. If you were running a program like this, wouldn't you scrub the backgrounds of everyone involved? The beauty of that answer, if you think about it, is how perfectly untestable it is. How do you prove something that was designed not to be proven? We're left with a choice between two possibilities, neither entirely satisfying. Either this was one of the most elaborate hoaxes in modern history, or it was exactly what a real cover-up would look like. People divided along the lines you'd expect. Some figured Bob had cooked up the whole story for attention or money, though he seemed to actively avoid both. Others believed something more calculated was happening. Maybe he was an unwitting pawn in a disinformation campaign designed to muddy the waters around what really went on out in the Nevada desert. But here's what nobody could argue. Bob Lazar had managed to transform Area 51 from an obscure footnote in aviation history into the most famous secret facility on Earth. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what was behind those warning signs in the Nevada desert. And frankly, we're still wondering. The conversation had fundamentally changed. People who had never heard of Groom Lake or S4 were now asking questions. UFO researchers called Lazar a whistleblower. Skeptics called him a fraud. But everyone was talking, and that was something new. In the time that followed, he met with more media. No longer hidden, he gave reply with a steady, even tone. He rarely veered from his account. He didn't mumble or ramble like a crackpot chasing after lights in the sky. He spoke with exactitude, a kind of cold, technical clarity that made it hard to dismiss him entirely. And as time went on, something fascinating happened. Some of the details Bob had mentioned, things that seemed impossible or made up in 1989, began finding quiet confirmation in satellite photos, uncovered Freedom of Information Act documents, and the kind of independent research that tends to get shrugged off until it doesn't. That hand reader he'd described, a device that checked bone length to permit entry. At the time, many found it odd, even made up. But later, photographic proof turned up of nearly the twin of what he had recalled in a military zone. Then came element 115. Back in '89, the word felt like fiction. No lab had verified it, but by 2003, a group from both the US and a former rival power made a new entry on the periodic table. Element 115, dubbed Muscovium. That variant, wildly reactive, it broke apart in a blink. But Lazar had claimed the one he handled held firm, an enduring kind, not yet within human reach. Real confirmation or merely parallel timing? The reveal gave his tale a new glimmer of weight. Real confirmations, or remarkable coincidences? That depends on how you prefer your mysteries solved. But here we find a riddle wrapped in a radiation warning. Who exactly was Bob Lazar? A renegade physicist, with clearance too high and a conscience too heavy? Or something more layered? A constructed myth, a controlled leak, or a man unknowingly caught in a game, with rules he never got to read? Hard to say. And maybe that's the point. Let's do a deep dive into the cracked terrain, beyond every checkpoint, every perimeter camera, where the asphalt turns to sand and the air is hot. We follow Lazar now, not just into the Nevada desert, but into the hollowed-out world beneath it. Into the area they call S4, a name murmured like a rumor or a warning. According to his account, it wasn't as easy as a badge swipe and a wave through. First came the security checks that went deeper than deep, polygraph tests that didn't just look for lies but for bad intentions, scrutiny that made airport security look like a friendly wave through. The transport felt more like a moving tomb. Windows tinted like obsidian. No conversation allowed. Just the low hum of engines carrying you deeper into nowhere. You weren't commuting to work. You were being taken somewhere beyond the reach of maps and normal oversight. Reality itself, Bob suggested, felt negotiable out there. The first time he saw the hangars, they didn't look like hangars at all. Not some Hollywood soundstage, mind you. They looked like part of the mountain, folded into living rock, hidden in plain sight. No hard edges, no obvious doors, just earth and stone until something moved. Then, without sound or ceremony, the mountain opened, and what waited inside rewrote everything he thought he knew about what was possible. 9 craft. Not one anomaly to be explained away or ignored, but 9 distinct vehicles, each one different as if built by entirely different minds. Some matched the classic flying saucer shape we'd all seen in movies and magazines. Others were stranger, angular, asymmetrical, almost organic in their design. Machines that somehow felt alive. The one they assigned to Bob, if assigned is even the right word, he called the sport model. Small, polished, efficient. It didn't sit on landing gear like every aircraft ever built. It hovered. Its metallic skin seemed to shimmer, not like chrome or steel, but like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Present but somehow refusing to be seen too clearly. No visible joints, bolts, or rivets. Nothing that resembled human construction methods. Bob's job wasn't to pilot these craft or even repair them. His role was more archaeological. Peel back layer after layer of the impossible and figure out how it all worked. Not why it existed or who had built it. Just the mechanics of the impossible. When he described the interior of the craft, something always shifted in his voice, like a man trying to explain a dream that wouldn't quite fade. Imagine him stooping down to enter while everything inside whispered, "You don't belong." The proportions felt like they'd been designed by architects who had never observed a human body, never watched how we move through the world. The seats, if that's what they were, waited like miniature thrones for rulers who would never come. Child-sized, but not childlike. Your hands would search instinctively for familiar controls, buttons, switches, displays, anything that spoke our technological language. But there was nothing recognizable. Just curves flowing into curves, surfaces melting together without interruption, like the whole interior had been sculpted from one plate of living metal. Rising from the floor like the backbone of some otherworldly giant was what Bob called the column, a structure he described with the kind of wonder usually reserved for cathedrals or bombs. This was where the real magic happened, machines that somehow felt alive. The one they assigned to Bob, if assigned is even the right word, he called the sport model. Small, polished, efficient. It didn't sit on landing gear like every aircraft ever built. It hovered. Its metallic skin seemed to shimmer, not like chrome or steel, but like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Present but somehow refusing to be seen too clearly. No visible joints, bolts, or rivets. nothing that resembled human construction methods. Bob's job wasn't to pilot these craft or even repair them. His role was more archaeological. Peel back layer after layer of the impossible and figure out how it all worked. Not why it existed or who had built it. Just the mechanics of the impossible. When he described the interior of the craft, something always shifted in his voice, like a man trying to explain a dream that wouldn't quite fade. Imagine him stooping down to enter while everything inside whispered, "You don't belong." The proportions felt like they'd been designed by architects who had never observed a human body, never watched how we move through the world. The seats, if that's what they were, waited like miniature thrones for rulers who would never come. Child-sized, but not childlike. Your hands would search instinctively for familiar controls, buttons, switches, displays, anything that spoke our technological language. But there was nothing recognizable. Just curves flowing into curves, surfaces melting together without interruption, like the whole interior had been sculpted from one plate of living metal. Rising from the floor like the backbone of some otherworldly giant was what Bob called the column. A structure he described with the kind of wonder usually reserved for cathedrals or bombs. This was where the real magic happened, if you can call technology so advanced it resembles magic by any other name. A quiet that hummed with tension, with power enough to fold the space-time continuum, like cosmic origami. Take a moment to absorb the gravity of that moment, confronted by technology like a magic no one has ever seen, trying to understand something designed for a world where cause followed effect but in a completely altered fashion. How do you take apart a miracle? How do you begin to unravel the mind of an alien? Picture Bob trying to explain a craft that shouldn't exist, using a vocabulary that barely qualified to do so. The power lay hidden beneath the floor, a triangle of marvel, like an altar to some unnamed deity of motion and matter. The power source, according to Bob, was element 115, a substance that didn't exist in any earthly laboratory when he first mentioned it. Bob told of it with exacting detail, like a researcher who had held it and watched it perform phenomena that redefined the order of the natural world. An element that dwelled beyond our periodic table, beyond our comprehension of how matter should behave according to natural law. He described it like an alchemist's dream made real, stable, potent, almost alive in the way it responded to energy. When the reactor touched it with precisely calibrated power, it would release waves of anti-gravity that flowed through the craft like blood through veins. It generated gravity waves that bent the continuum, allowing the craft to manipulate the very fabric of reality, to fold that continuum like paper and leap from one coordinate to another without journeying between. Imagine the magnitude involved. Not the dystopian fiction version we've grown comfortable with, but the raw ramifications. A technology that makes contiguity irrelevant, that treats the fundamental structure of our galaxy as an entity that can be altered. Lazar told of watching craft that could be here, then there, with nothing in between. Not velocity, not time, easily relocating from one manner of being to another. The lingering question, the one that roots uncomfortably in the quiet areas of his account, is fundamental. If this is true, what does it mean for everything we think we know about our world? Then there were what Bob called gravity amplifiers. 3 of them, though the name felt inadequate for what they really did. Technology that could reach out into the fabric of reality and give it a gentle nudge. Not the brute force of a rocket engine against gravity, but something far more elegant where the continuum quietly submitted. The craft didn't really fly, not in any way we'd understand. Instead, it performed a kind of cosmic sleight of hand. It would create a shield like a bubble and compact the space ahead while stretching the distance behind, then effortlessly fall forward into the depression it had created. Like rolling a marble into a bowl that very marble had crafted. Envision watching something move from here to there without crossing the space between. No roar of engines, no trail of fire, just a silent slip through folded reality that made you question everything you thought you understood about how the universe works. No cooling system, no radiation leak, just pure, impossible energy doing what energy wasn't supposed to do, making the heavy weightless, turning the principle of motion into poetry. Bob described standing in the sweltering Nevada heat, watching demonstrations that rewrote the laws of physics in real time. The craft didn't lumber into the sky like our machines. It simply lifted, effortless as a thought becoming real. He described the way it hovered there, suspended in air that seemed to hold it like water holds a leaf. Then, without warning, without the gradual acceleration that every earthly aircraft required, it shot away at angles that made no sense to anyone who'd studied the rules of flight. It moved like something alive, smooth, unpredictable, almost natural in its impossibility. The only sign of its presence was a vibration you felt more than heard, a low thrumming deep in your ribcage, like the low hum of a distant turbine. Standing there, watching that impossible dance in the sky, Bob came to a realization that probably changed him forever. This wasn't some breakthrough stolen from the Soviets, wasn't the next generation of American aerospace engineering. This was something else entirely, something that had learned to fly in a different solar system. But knowledge like that comes with a price, doesn't it? Over the weeks that followed, Bob started noticing things. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room, the helicopters that seemed to find reasons to patrol his community, the sedans with windows dark as midnight that would park just a little too long on his street. Picture Bob staring at technology that made him feel like a caveman trying to reverse engineer a smartphone. This wasn't just advanced. It was so far beyond human understanding, as if someone had placed a burning echo of the cosmos in his lap and said, "Now, make sense of that." He'd spend hours hunched over components that defied every principle he'd learned in school, turning them over in his hands like puzzle pieces from a game no one had taught him to play. The frustration must have been maddening. Here was the discovery of the century, maybe the millennium, and he could barely grasp the edge of how it functioned. But that was by design, wasn't it? The whole operation ran on segmentation so strict it felt almost paranoid. Bob worked on propulsion while someone 3 hangars over studied the whole material, and another team, maybe in a completely different building, tried to decode the control systems. Nobody talked to anybody. Nobody saw the big picture. It was like being handed a single page from the middle of the most technical manuscript known to mankind. The secrecy wrapped around everything like a second atmosphere. Armed guards stood at every corner, their eyes following your movements even when you were just walking to the bathroom. Conversations died when you entered a room. Phone calls were monitored. Even a casual chat about the weather felt dangerous, because who knew what innocent comment might reveal something you weren't supposed to know. They made it clear from day one. Your job existed only within these walls. Step outside, mention anything at all, about what you'd seen, and you wouldn't just lose your paycheck. You might lose much more than that. Living under that kind of pressure changes a person. Every word becomes measured. Every glance over your shoulder becomes automatic. You start to wonder if even your thoughts are being watched. Despite all the attention his story generated, Bob never yearned for glory. He withdrew from public view, opening a quiet firm where he crafted lab equipment by hand. He turned away nearly every media inquiry. Driven by fear, drained by fame. The behavior of someone telling the truth about something he wished he'd never seen, rather than someone enjoying the attention from an elaborate hoax. Time has moved on, but the mystery around that desert facility has only deepened. Out beyond Nevada's empty highways, there's still something in the air, a kind of echo hinting at truths buried in sand and stone, and a man who dared to peek behind a curtain that was meant to stay closed. We may never know the complete truth about Bob Lazar's claims, but in the decades since he first spoke out, one thing has become clear. He changed the conversation forever. Area 51 went from military footnote to cultural phenomenon. Questions that were never asked became impossible to ignore. And in a world where official secrets seem to multiply by the day, sometimes the most important stories are the ones that can never be fully verified. The desert keeps its secrets, just like it always has. But occasionally, if you know where to look and when to listen, it whispers them to those brave enough, or foolish enough, to hear what it has to say. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's exactly how the best mysteries are supposed to work. But Bob never returned to the desert facility. Whatever happened at that hidden outpost, it had marked him. Instead of pushing deeper into the unknown, he chose a quieter path, built instruments, ran a shop, kept his head down. But the weight of what he'd encountered lingered like a fog that never fully lifted. For those who followed his journey, he'd already revealed enough. Enough to shift the frame of the possible. Enough to raise quiet doubts about what lay beneath dry Nevada soil. When he stepped forward in '89, Bob knew the world might doubt him. What he didn't expect was how deeply his past would be torn apart. Doubters, journalists, even official figures began a quiet hunt, searching for weak points in his tale. The first target, his academic background. Bob still insisted his degrees from MIT and Caltech had vanished because of government sabotage, leaving only a blank space where credentials should have been. He again pointed to missing job records at Los Alamos as more proof. But a few artifacts surfaced, a phone directory from the early '80s listing him as a technician, a news story linking him to particle work. Proof, perhaps, that he had walked the halls of places reserved for the sharpest minds. Still, critics pushed back. They argued he may have been a junior contractor, that he might have studied physics, but not at the schools he claimed. Doubt crept in. And then, unrelated trouble struck. In the early '90s, Bob got pulled into a legal case. It had nothing to do with hidden craft, but it wrecked what little trust remained. Now, to much of the world, he was just a former lab tech with a record. Yet not everyone turned away. To some, this fallout was no accident. They believed it was a quiet campaign, meant to discredit, to humiliate, to erase. Not by force, but by erosion. To them, Bob wasn't a criminal. He was a warning. With time, the chaos faded. He moved again, Michigan first, then back to Nevada. A little workshop, a business named United Nuclear. Nothing flashy, just flasks, powders, coils. Work with quiet purpose. He no longer chased cameras. On the rare occasions he spoke, his message never changed. "I'm not trying to convince anyone," he once said. "I'm just telling you what I know, what I saw." There was a stillness in the way he said it, not desperate, not theatrical. More like someone recounting a memory he wished he could forget. Then, in 2018, nearly 3 decades later, Bob reappeared. A filmmaker, Jeremy Corbell, brought him back into the light with a quiet, haunting documentary. It didn't offer new proof, but it offered something else, a glimpse of a man weathered by time, and perhaps by truth. He spoke of the years after his first interview. The strange nights, footsteps outside, a blackout that came without warning. His wife, Joy, remembered the low hum on the phone line, the feeling of being observed even in still moments. Their home, their lives, caught in a kind of quiet pressure. No agents in black, no gunfights, just presence and worry. Still, Bob stood by his account. "If I could go back," he said softly, "I probably wouldn't change anything. I didn't ask for this, but I won't lie about what I saw." For many, that was the line that never faded. By then, his tale had become more than just a claim. It had become a lens. Some still believed he made it up. Others clung to every detail. But more than that, people began to ask why his story had lasted. Maybe it wasn't about proving him right or wrong. Maybe it was about what his story revealed, a deep need to know, to reach, to wonder, a sense that something vast and hidden might lurk just beyond the edge of what we're told. And in the shadows where air turns cold and the night hums with electric quiet, that wonder still stirs. His wife, Joy, remembered the low hum on the phone line, the feeling of being observed even in still moments. Their home, their lives, caught in a kind of quiet pressure. No agents in black or guns. Just presence. And worry. Still, Bob stood by his account. If I could go back, I probably wouldn't change anything. I didn't ask for this, but I won't lie about what I saw. For many, that was the line that never faded. By then, his tale had become more than just a claim. It had become a lens. Some still believed he made it up. Others clung to every detail. But more than that, people began to ask why his story had lasted. Maybe it wasn't about proving him right or wrong. Maybe it was about what his story revealed, a deep need to know, to reach, to wonder, a sense that something vast and hidden might lurk just beyond the edge of what we're told. And in the shadows where air turns cold and the night hums with electric quiet, that wonder still stirs. Over time, Bob faded from controversy and became something else, part myth, part man. He wasn't just the guy who talked about alien machines. He was the one who never changed his tune. In a world full of shifting stories, that kind of steadiness stood out. People came from across the country just to find him. Not to buy lab supplies, but to meet the man. To look him in the eye and say, "I believe you." Some left with tears. Others said nothing at all. Bob didn't always know how to handle it. He'd nod, murmur thanks, then return to the rhythm of his work, mixing compounds, restocking shelves, printing shipping labels. His life moved on, but part of him never left that hangar in the desert. And when asked, "Do you still think about S4?" his answer never changed. Every day. As years moved on, Bob's account didn't just survive. It settled into the fabric of modern folklore. Not because it grew more elaborate, but because it stayed the same. Over and over, the same moments, the same words, that same quiet tone. Not a sales pitch, a memory. And then something strange began to happen. By the 2020s, the world shifted. Military pilots went public. Government reports hinted at unknown craft. Even NASA weighed in. The silence that once surrounded the UFO topic began to crack. Bob watched all of it, quietly, from the background. He never said, "I told you so." But in each revelation, he heard a familiar note. Propulsion without heat, flight without wings, movement that ignored inertia. Details that matched what he'd described long ago. One moment stood out. A closed congressional meeting. A high-ranking official was asked, point blank, if the government had recovered non-human craft. The reply never went public. But the rumor? One word. Yes. For those who had followed Bob's story, it felt like a faint signal, something brushing the edges of confirmation. His online community exploded. Forums dissected old interviews. His voice, steady and technical, carried new weight. He never asked for fame, never asked for money. He just spoke and let the rest fall where it may. Some went further. Teams tried to find S4. They used satellite maps, terrain overlays, Bob's old sketches. Nothing clear ever turned up. The place, if it ever existed, had been buried or scrubbed. Bob never tried to return. When asked why, he answered with quiet certainty, "I wouldn't get close. Not again." He carried fragments of the past with him. The arc of that machine when it lifted. The way light warped around the craft when it powered up. The layout of the hangars burned into his mind. These weren't daydreams. They were anchors. Things that rooted him to an event he couldn't forget. In his shop, between coils and glassware, he'd sometimes draw. A craft, a fuel element, a drive system. The same sketches. Unchanged. Unembellished. Just what he remembered. Even skeptics started to waver. A few admitted, if this was a hoax, it was a flawless one. Decades without a crack. No added drama. No evolving script. Just one account, repeated. That didn't prove anything, but it made them look again. In an age filled with noise, Lazar remained quiet. And somehow, that quiet gave his story more gravity. Because at its core, it wasn't about flying objects. It was about truth. About what happens when someone sees something they weren't meant to, and tells the world anyway. Whether you believed him or not, Bob left a question behind. A single, haunting question. What if he wasn't lying? That thought, small, quiet, hung in the air long after the interviews ended. It followed people home. It showed up in midnight forums and late-night drives through the desert. It stayed. Bob didn't disappear. But he didn't chase the spotlight either. He chose a quieter life, staying tucked between myth and memory. In a modest home with his wife, he kept to routines. The shop, the shipments, the lab notes. But in drawers and folders, relics waited, old photos, diagrams, pieces of a past that most still doubted. He never clung to them, but he didn't discard them either. Every now and then, someone would ask, "Do you still believe?" Bob never blinked. "It's not belief," he'd say. "It's what I saw." He didn't argue. He didn't convince. He just remembered. And that memory carried weight, deep, lasting, carved into the quiet of his voice. Colleagues noticed it, the steadiness, the refusal to bend the story, no matter the mood of the moment. That kind of restraint, rare. Bob didn't build a movement. He never claimed to be a prophet. He wanted one thing, for someone to listen, maybe think, maybe wonder. New disclosures kept surfacing, Navy sightings, leaked footage, congressional hearings. And every time the news stirred the water, Bob's name returned to the surface. Not in bold type, in a whisper, "Remember Bob." And each time, he stood where he always had, steady, undramatic, resigned. He once said the hardest part wasn't being doubted. It was knowing that what he saw could have changed everything. Not just propulsion, but how we view energy, motion, gravity itself. And it was locked away. He never speculated, never offered wild theories. He kept to what he knew. In that, there was a strange kind of honesty. You could hear it in his voice. He still tinkered, built odd machines, played with magnets, ran experiments. He never stopped being that kid with a jet engine on a bike. The wonder hadn't dimmed, it had just matured. To those who visited, he was quiet, thoughtful, no alien posters, no hype. Just a man, older now, who remembered something the world still couldn't explain. Sometimes he'd step outside, late at night, and stare at the sky. Not looking for ships, just thinking, remembering, as if the stars knew something he couldn't say. In those later years, Bob became something symbolic. Not flashy, not viral, but enduring. He wasn't the answer. He was the question. A fixed point in the vast unknown. If even one thing he said was real, it meant the impossible had already touched down and been hidden. His voice slowed over time, but the clarity never left. The same sharp eyes, the same calm tone. And when asked, "Would you do it again?" he paused, then nodded. "Yes," he said, "because the story is bigger than I am." That's what lingered, bigger than I am. He didn't chase attention. He carried a burden, a quiet awe, not fear, respect. As if he'd seen something sacred. And sacred things don't get explained, they get remembered. At his last public appearance, a small science gathering, Bob didn't speak. He just stood at the back, People noticed. They approached softly. No flash, no selfies. Just quiet thanks. And one last question. What would you want to leave behind? His answer was simple. Keep asking. And never assume the truth is what you're told. Sometimes it hides in the quiet. And that quiet, that stillness, was how Bob will be remembered. Bob is still with us but lives a private life. Bob didn't offer answers. He left questions. And sometimes, that's the more powerful gift. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't perfect. He was just a man who saw something impossible and told the world. And whether you accept it or not, you remember it. You lie awake. You glance at the night sky. And you wonder. And somewhere in that pause, between dream and thought, you hear the echo. Gravity amplifiers. Element 115. Sport model. S4. A whisper. A memory. And maybe that's how the story lives on. Not in proof, but in wonder. Because when the world forgets, the stars still shine. And the desert wind still carries the name of the man who said he saw what we weren't ready to believe. But perhaps the real question isn't whether Bob Lazar was telling the truth. It's whether we are finally ready to hear it. It's been a pleasure to have your company for the broadcast. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Drop your encounters in the comments below. The unexplained moments. The sightings that made you question everything. We always monitor the feed, even after the broadcast ends. And remember, not everything that helps you sleep is a lullaby. Good night, sleep well.